Well, Charles, what would George Orwell have made of Maggie Thatcher?
Well, I always refuse to answer the what would she question, because I only know what she did do. That's my only selling point, and I don't like to speculate. But I think what's very interesting about Orwell as a study is that he's someone from the left who also is very suspicious of some of the tendencies on the left, and was therefore never tempted to totalitarianism, even of the left, obviously not of the right. And one of the things that Mrs. Thatcher brought out much more strongly in the Tory party than had previously been the case was a sort of global detestation of totalitarianism. This was much more true of her than it was of, say, Edward Heath in relation to Soviet tyranny. And this was one of the reasons, actually, why Mrs. Thatcher attracted quite a lot of recruits among moderate left intellectuals and trade union leaders and things, because they had to deal with infiltration, subversion, and the promotion of tyrannous ideology. And I think in that sense, there's a sort of genealogy of ideas coming from Orwell and reaching her. And it's an odd point, but it's worth saying that, emphasizing that Conservative Party was not historically very good on this. What it tended to do was sort of just not, it obviously wasn't pro-Soviet, but it just didn't pay much attention to it. It just sort of got on with international relations and defense and so on, but it didn't think about the nasty ideology, the oppressive ideology very much, and she really did. That was a central part of her thinking. And of course, she was a great admirer of Orwell because of 1984 and Animal Farm, as she was of Koestler.
So she'd have shared her very powerful anti-communism, but I don't suppose he would have admired her approach to the state with the same enthusiasm, Charles.
Orwell doesn't show much interest in his writings in economic questions, so he doesn't seem to be very interested in free markets or in state control of markets. I mean, he's obviously much more statist in that sense than Mrs. Thatcher, but it's not really something that he devotes much thought to. He's thinking more about oppression versus freedom, I think, and worried about the state in that sense. Both of them, they obviously are very different people, but both of them were very, very affected, of course, by the experience of the war. And you see that, and actually, in particular in The Lion and the Unicorn, you see all expressing quite small c conservative, old-fashioned patriotic instincts against what would now be called the metropolitan elite. I mean, that cliche wasn't invented at that time, but that's what he's doing.
Yeah, he's not very fond of the former ruling class, is he?
No, he's not. But what he says about that is, and nor is Mrs. Thatcher, of course, in a way. But,
that is a nice point, yeah.
But what he sort of says about that is that they're not really the problem anymore. It's much more of a problem of the people who really aren't patriotic, which he characterizes as a sort of what we would now call a metropolitan elite.
Very much so. He goes after these intellectuals whose the one thing they won't do is support their own country, doesn't he? Yeah. And that there is a sort of Thatcher thing there, isn't there?
There is, or to put it another way around, that she in some ways was Orwellian, because after all she came afterwards.
Yeah, yes, of course. Now I want to, because you're writing the third, this is the final, isn't it, book of
it is, yeah.
On Maggie. It's quite timely or relevant to raise this long discussion I had over lunch with Richard Ryder and the late Frank Johnson at the Garrick Club, in which Ryder argued, and he was a junior minister under Maggie before becoming chief whip under Major, that there were two Thatchers. There was an in-office Thatcher and a post-office, or a very late period post-office Thatcher, in which she became something she hadn't been, i.e. a sort of an ardent Brexiteer, much more ideological, much less pragmatic than she had been in office. And I wondered, in the context of your book here, whether that you've accepted quite a lot of what Richard Ryder would have said.
I think I do accept it, but I would qualify it. He's absolutely right that she was pragmatic. One of the most surprising qualities of her as a leader was that she was cautious. It sounds strange, but she was also very bold. Yep. But one of her favourite sayings was, time spent in reconnaissance is never wasted. She was always going through the detail again and again, if you think of a timing issue like the miners' strike, she gave in to the miners in 1981 because she wasn't ready. And then when she was ready, she was prepared to fight it through to the end. So I think there was a difference. And of course, when all prime ministers lose office, they become undisciplined. They, because they don't have all that information, they don't have to make the decisions. They get a bit dislocated. And that happened to Mrs. Thatcher. And therefore, she became, I think, more strident. Where I would disagree with Richard Ryder is I think her basic ideology was always there. It did develop a bit, it did change, but it was always a very important part of her attitude, both in office and after office. And the Brexit example is an important one because while she's certainly hardened up on the subject, there's a continuity of thought about Europe, which becomes apparent actually as soon as she came into office in 1979, and then grows and grows, and then becomes much more explicit after leaving office.
Well, the break point was really the Bruce speech, wasn't it?
That's not when her views changed, it's when they were most clearly publicly expressed. That's 1988. Actually, rather interestingly, in the same month as she also made her great Green speech, the first great speech about global warming ever made by a world leader. So one of the interesting things about Mrs. Thatcher is the sort of renewal of ideas, the interest in coming up even quite late in her career. She'd been 9 years in office at that point. 2 seismic speeches in about 2 weeks. Bruges speech on the European community, which was not a Brexit speech, but was a highly sceptical speech. And then her speech to the Royal Society when she unveils the whole climate change argument.
One of the things which comes very strongly from all of your books is here was a figure who, however unpopular she was, had an enormous sense of propriety in office. I wonder how you feel as the biographer of Margaret Thatcher, looking at the current Tory leader and Prime Minister, who takes an opposite approach, who seems to want to attack the institutions of the state, is contemptuous of parliamentary sovereignty, is hostile to the rule of law, lies every day. There's Maggie Thatcher hardly lied at all in her long career. Johnson lies every day. He or one of his ministers will make a fresh assault on truth. How do you feel looking at Boris Johnson?
Well, I think you're being too kind to Mrs. Thatcher and too harsh on Boris. The truth of the matter is that all prime ministers find themselves in very, very difficult situations. And it's not true that Mrs. Thatcher was not ruthless in some of these areas. It is true that she did have a scrupulous regard for truth, but she wasn't always telling the whole truth, as you would expect, really, in this wicked world. And so when you can see her in an interview, when she gets really fierce, hitting back, that's on television, that's usually because she's hiding something. And what she was very clever at was not telling an actual flat untruth. Where I think Mrs. Thatcher was much more scrupulous than modern politicians, and I think the change came with Tony Blair and went on and continues to this day with Boris Johnson, is that she did respect governmental process. There was much less of this so-called sofa government that was really invented by Tony Blair. So people would always think, oh, I'll go and talk to Margaret and I'll win her around and we can do this all informally. And she liked talking to people, but actually that's not how she governed. She governed through paper. And that's why it's so fascinating for me as the biographer to look at how she did this. She got this enormous volume of government paper coming through, memos, briefings and so on. And she wrote all over. She didn't write her own memos, she wrote all over other people's. And what she's doing there is literally impressing her view upon events, and then handing that out to private secretaries who disseminate it through the system. And she was, by and large, except in very political things, following the system. That really disappeared, and it's made much worse, of course, by the age of the internet. It began to disappear under Blair.
We're not going to let you get away as easily as all that. So what you have now, which I find quite amazing, is daily lies coming out of Downing Street. And I chronicled them in the article submitted for the Orwell Prize. And
yes,
the deliberate use of political figures inside Downing Street to put direct lies out into the public domain, and it happens all the time. It didn't. Can you give me a single example of that happening under Thatcher?
Well, it was accused of happening the entire time.
Accused of? Can you give me an example? You're the biographer.
Well, I'm very reluctant in politics, democratic politics, to use the word lie of anybody. I think it's a very exaggerated word for people in very difficult situations.
Well, I will use the word lie as a deliberate deceit put out into the public domain. And you're getting that, and I itemize it in my submission to the Orwell Prize, put out that by Downing Street, by, yes, Boris Johnson's people, and often by Boris Johnson himself. Now, Maggie Thatcher, I looked, when I wrote my history of political lying, I looked at her career, and I got a lot of criticism from the left. I could only find two examples in the 11 years she was Prime Minister. One was the Belgrano, and one was the Westland affair. Westland affair is unresolved. Belgrano, it may be that she was caught on the hop in a radio program. Apart from that, you could not find you could find lots of accusations by her political opponent. You couldn't find an example of somebody of her deliberately uttering an untruth. And I'm surprised, whereas Johnson and his crew do that all the time now, daily.
You see, that I don't, as I say, I don't like this word because I think it depends. It's always used as part of political conduct.
No, I'm using it as a factual word, which is a factual statement of fact, a deliberate issuing of mendacious information, not mistakenly, deliberately misinforming the public. They've done it repeatedly on coronavirus. They did it repeatedly on Brexit. They did it throughout the 2019 general election.
I understand that's what you're saying, Peter, but I don't. I never use that word of any political party. I think it's unwise.
The next distinction I see between Thatcher and Johnson is that Thatcher, right up to the end, had a broad church as in her cabinet. She retained what were known, I think, as the Wets, and she embraced the idea of a conservative party, which was a broad church conservative party. What you have now is something quite different. A lot of respected figures, Rory Stewart, Dominic Grieve, Ken Clarke, driven out of the Conservative Party. You now have a sect rather than a broad party. That is a big difference, isn't it?
I don't really agree with that because I think the circumstances are so different. What one has to remember is that this government is set up following the May government, and the May government collapsed because it could not get cabinet unity, and therefore it was a priority in order to achieve Brexit above all to have a government which could at the top more or less agree. So I don't really accept that.
Well, hang on, Maggie Thatcher was fighting an equally momentous battle imposing new monetary policies, actually establishing a new social and economic structure in Britain. And she tolerated inside her cabinet, right up to the end, a whole load of senior and respected figures, including Michael Heseltine. Well, he went halfway through, but Whitelaw, Peter Walker. And it was a party which could appeal to the country at large, not in the way the current cabinet surely do.
Well, she didn't tolerate Michael Heseltine, and she neutralised people like Peter Walker.
Well, hang on, Heseltine existed for 7 years. He wasn't stripped of the whip after about three or 4 weeks.
No, indeed, but there's a reason for that, which is
a big difference too.
There is a difference, but there is a fundamental reason for that, which is that this government, the Johnson government, felt that it had to achieve Brexit. It was an absolutely specific thing it had to do, and it was mandated to do in a vote. And therefore, it could not carry at the highest levels of the government people who didn't want to do that. And that's not the same as the Thatcher project, which is a much more complicated project going over many years, iterated, changing, developing, where there were very fierce clashes sometimes, but not this sort of great existential thing that must happen. So I don't think it's a right comparison.
Now, Maggie Thatcher, although was really admired and respected the institutions of the British state. Look at the way Boris Johnson and Michael Gove have treated the monarchy. leaking private conversations with the Queen to the Sun, misleading her about the prorogation of Parliament, dragging the monarchy into politics. I don't think Maggie Thatcher ever did that, did she?
She certainly was extremely scrupulous about the Queen, there's no doubt about that. But you see, I think you're saying things that are tendentious. I think it's very arguable about the prorogation that this is not correct. You know, I wouldn't agree with the analysis. So that, again, I resist the idea that such bad motives are attributed to a particular government.
I'm not attributing motives, I'm stating facts.
Well, I don't agree with that.
I'm very careful not to attribute motive. I don't think you can. I'm just trying to analyze the difference between.
Well, when the word lie is an attribution.
Well, no, it's not. It is no, but when you can prove that somebody knowingly tells untruths, that you can repeatedly with Johnson, Gove, Hancock, and others. It is a word you must use. You're bound to use it, in my view, if it is actually happening and it can be proven.
Well, I don't think it's wise. I don't think it's right.
I'll send you my dossier of the lies told by Johnson and his colleagues. I will send it over to you, and you can study it. And if you disagree with it, I look forward to seeing your rebuttal. I use the term very carefully and in terms.
What I would say is that all modern government, and the Johnson government is guilty of it. It doesn't govern through the cabinet, and the office of Prime Minister has been over-aggrandized in a sort of imitation of the American presidency, which is wrong because it's not a head of state job, it's a head of government job.
Yeah, I quite agree. Are we seeing something very interesting on both sides of the Atlantic? Let's look at Thatcher, Reagan, Bush, and then let's look at Johnson, Trump. Are we seeing something happening to the conservative right in the Republican Party and in the Conservative Party? A lurch to a much more populist, much more right-wing, in many ways alt-right form of government, and a new epistemology in Trump and Johnson, which is moving away from truth towards routine fabrication, a routine demagoguery, i.e. the use of openly racist language on both sides of the Atlantic. And and I think that Thatcher was quite a moderate figure, quite a restrained figure, certainly a constitutional figure in the tradition of Burke and Oakeshott, whereas what you have with Johnson and Trump is something much more demagogic, much more hostile to constitutional democracy.
I remember that all these things were very much said against Mrs. Thatcher at the time. And I'm resisting the idea that we should all get too heated about what's happening now because it's what's going on now. I'm trying to stand back a bit from it. And I think on that basis, one has to be a bit careful about chucking all these accusations. I mean, I'm surprised, for example, that you say that Johnson's government is an alt-right government. It's an absolutely massive extension of state power in a socialist manner. In what's happened.
Well, it's not just a left-wing thing, the use of state power.
No, but I'm talking about state economic power, so that
yeah, all bad clientelism. Yeah, that's exactly what you get in
which may in fact be necessary because of the horrors of COVID. But it's certainly, I wouldn't call it, whatever it is, I wouldn't call it a sort of lurch to the right. When you're trying to do something difficult, people will of course go for you tremendously hard, and that is true of Thatcher and of Johnson.
Margaret Thatcher would never have appointed an advisor, would she, who had been found already in contempt of Parliament? Well, she really respected parliamentary democracy.
She certainly believed in parliamentary democracy. She didn't like Parliament in a personal sense.
I didn't say she liked it. I said respected it.
Yeah, I think that's correct. Yeah. Yeah.
Johnson doesn't respect Parliament. He appointed somebody who was in contempt of Parliament as his advisor.
I think, again, you have to look at it. If we were all dealing with this historically, you would see why these problems arose, which is that the situation in Parliament, with Parliament, and the behaviour within Parliament over the Brexit thing was the most extraordinary problem. And it didn't reflect well on many of the people involved, including many of the people who are seen as primarily parliamentary. And so we were almost like, it's not as extreme, but it's slightly like arguing of who had the better understanding about Parliament and who behaved better in the Civil War. And the answer is, people behaved extremely badly. I'm not really going down your route, Peter, where I think there are all these appalling, dreadful things are being done by the present government. I can think of many mistakes and a lot of carelessness and a great many difficulties, but I don't agree with the fundamental portrait you're putting forward.
You look at the Thatcher government and the backgrounds to that administration. They look, some of them whom now look quite tiring figures, Tebbit and Lawson. There weren't that many journalists among them with background, of course Lawson being an example.
That's right. And Lawson was indeed a very well-known journalist and had edited The Spectator. And this may have sometimes trapped him into saying too much, which is the problem of our trade in politics. But broadly speaking, Mrs. Thatcher was not interested in journalism and journalists. And she never read the newspapers. She literally never read the newspapers. You have to remember, in fairness to modern politicians, that they have the nightmare of the 24-hour news cycle and of the internet and Twitter and all the rest of it. Whereas Mrs. Thatcher began as Prime Minister with only 3 television channels and, of course, no internet. So it was a very different world. But what she understood very well the importance of journalism, and she would cultivate a few journalists. She was very good at flattering writers. She'd say, "Oh, you're such a wonderful wordsmith." And they'd all sort of swoon. But and she knew that she had to have good relations with the popular press, like the Sun and the Mail and so on. And she cultivated those. But what she did not do was think all the time, what's the headline going to be for this policy? She tried to work out what it was she was trying to do and to do it, and in the process of doing it, to sell it to the newspapers. And I fear that the modern way is worse than that, because it starts from the headline rather than the policy. So it tries to think about, and indeed sometimes the headline is produced by the government before there is a policy.
It said that the current genius idea to introduce quarantine 3 months after that it was popular, 3 months after maybe it would have been a good idea to introduce it, that has been forced through by the communications people.
I believe that to be so. I'm not absolutely on top of that, but I believe that to be so. Again, this went through Blair, Brown, Cameron, Johnson, not so much Mrs. May. And what it is somebody has a bright idea which will dominate the news cycle for the day, and this is announced as a government policy, but it hasn't yet happened, actually. And there hasn't been the civil service work, and there hasn't been the due process. This is really no use to anybody. Though I must point out that Mrs. Thatcher did used to use television appearances to announce policies sometimes, which she did quite deliberately because she knew other people in her government didn't want them. And so to get them out into the public domain was very important before they could catch up with her. So let's suggest that she wasn't pretty cunning too. But what's the worry, I think now is a worry, is that it leads to a lack of direction. You don't think, right, the government has 3 things it's really trying to do or whatever. You think it's just jumping around one thing after another. What's it going to announce? What's it going to tweet? And that is obviously not a form of good government.
And when you get a major once-in-a-century crisis like coronavirus, that methodology is really not applicable at all and disastrous.
It's not, but I'm very critical of the media in the coronavirus story, because I think they've quite deliberately tried to destroy morale. I do feel that, unlike normal times, this is an occasion where there should be more restraint on the part of the media. I know we don't like to say that because it sounds like an attack on free speech, but I think really to give so little credit to the authorities, of which the government is the most prominent, but all the authorities, about what they're doing is, and to look at it all so pessimistically, it's just so extraordinarily tiresome. And so I think our trade.
Yeah, I wonder. I think that there was actually a mood of national unity and a great deal of responsibility from the media, but the moment when the Prime Minister's senior advisor defied government guidelines, and the Prime Minister stood by that advisor, I think Mrs. Thatcher would have been too shrewd, but also too moral to allow that to happen.
Well, I don't agree with that. Mrs. Thatcher was fierce in defending her advisors, and wouldn't accept Nigel Lawson's demand that Alan Walters go, and therefore she was preferred to accept.
No, but Mr. Walters' only crime was to advise Mrs. Thatcher about economics.
No, that's not true. He
signed it off on one occasion, a lunch which he'd had a union discount had been leaked.
No, a great many actually.
But
I mean, a great many.
It was not on the same scale as in a great national health emergency, breaching government-like guidelines and exposing the whole government to the charge of hypocrisy.
My own view of that was that this was a very, very unfair on Dominic Cummings, because he did have a real, true, genuine problem about his child, which anybody who, as the father of a child in such a situation...
We heard that defence, but there were millions of people in this country. Anyway, it's not really what we're talking about.
So I think that, to me, it was an example of media viciousness, that it was absolutely unrestrained and unfair. And I think this is a problem which again is aggravated by the sort of combative world that you're talking about with Trump and so on, in which people are bashing one another on a sort of cosmic scale, particularly through Twitter, and politics is terribly polarized, and therefore nobody wishes to try and understand the actions of the other side. They just wish to bash them.
We would both agreed that Orwell would find many things, just to bring on the conversation maybe to an end, that Orwell would have found many things to admire in Margaret Thatcher and vice versa. Do you think Orwell would have found much to admire in the current Tory leader?
Well, one thing that, of course, Mrs. Thatcher didn't have a particular gift for, and Orwell did, and Boris does, is writing about politics. And Boris is a superb writer about politics, and I can easily imagine George Orwell enjoying the journalism and books of Boris Johnson, as indeed is the case vice versa.
I don't find the thought experiment quite as easy.